are two systems of courts?
10, Mississippi.
Do the 14th. All right, Secretary of State.
Secretary of State.
Deals with everything outside of America.
Deals with everything outside.
Hi, and welcome back to Mr. Raymond's Civics EOC Academy. Just a reminder, while these videos were designed for students taking the Florida end of course exam, they'll work for any civics or U.S. government class, as well as people taking the naturalization exam. So chances are, if you found them, you're in the right place. So today we're going to be looking at the events in America leading up to the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Now, some of these, like the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party, you're probably already familiar with. But we're going to try to fill in some of the blanks for you on the road to the American Revolution. And it's important that you keep these events in chronological order, as I've definitely seen EOC questions where they're going to ask you to put these into order. Okay, so I usually have my kids make a timeline of these events. And this brings us to our benchmark, which says, describe how English policies and responses to colonial concerns led to the writing of the Declaration. In other words, the English policies are the things that make us, the colonies, angry. Can you say taxes? And we finally declare our independence, which is just a big document saying, hey, England, it's over. So our first event is the French and Indian War from 1754 to 1763. Now, you will learn about this next year if you're taking U.S. history. And luckily, we don't have to know that much about it. But let's just get some of the basics. First of all, the name French and Indian War is what people in America called it. And it's only part of the war, the part that was fought over here. And this was just a part of a global war that was fought between Great Britain, which, remember, at this point in 1754, we are still part of Great Britain. So it's really us against the French and Indians. And this is known as the 7 Years' War. Now, the only thing you really need to know is that Great Britain, or I guess us, not really, but that Great Britain wins. And they spend a lot of money fighting this war. And afterwards, because they're in big debt, they turn to the American colonies to help them pay back some of that money. And how would they get that money out of us? Taxes. Okay, taxes in the U.S. were nothing new. We've been taxing ourselves for a long time, but these taxes were different. They were taxes passed on us by the King and Parliament of Great Britain. And while Americans, for the most part, still thought of themselves as British subjects, we were kind of used to running things over here by ourselves. One of the first of these taxes was known as the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act is kind of what it sounds like. Just like we put stamps on pieces of mail, the British wanted us to put taxes on all paper goods. I'm talking newspapers and writing paper and even playing cards. Now, as you can imagine, this made the colonists really angry. No one likes spending more money. And it wasn't so much the money, but it was the fact that this was only a tax on us. And they responded immediately by boycotting British goods. A boycott is when you refuse to buy something or use somebody's services. A boycott is kind of like, hey, don't buy anything from them, okay? So how did the British react? Well, nothing hurts like hitting people in their wallets. And after they had lost a lot of money and there was a lot of protesting and boycotting, the British repealed the Stamp Act. Now, repeal is a word you should know, and that means to revoke or get rid of. So the British got rid of the Stamp Act. Now, the reaction to the Stamp Act was very telling. Again, the colonists were British, and most of them were proud to be British. But this was kind of like when kids start growing up and they rebel against their parents. These are protests that, with people carrying signs and burning tax collectors in effigy, the colonists were letting the British know, hey, don't mess with us. So what does a parent do when their kid starts acting up? Well, sometimes they put the smack down on them. And that's what the British did. They passed the first of two laws that would be known as the Quartering Acts. The British, to keep these rebellious colonists in line, started sending over a bunch of British soldiers. Now, they didn't really have any military bases over here to keep them. So what did the soldiers do? Well, they moved into the colonists' homes. To provide someone with quarters is to give them a place to stay. Now, as you can imagine, this did not go over well. Can you imagine a bunch of soldiers showing up at your door and saying that they were moving in? Yeah, you would not be happy. Now, because Parliament, and remember Parliament is the British legislature or lawmaking body, because they and the king had gotten rid of the Stamp Act, they needed another way to make money. So they passed what was called the Townshend Acts. And this was a duty, by the way, duty, no, not duty, a duty is a word you should know, and that's another word for tax. They put a duty or tax on what were known as finished goods, and these were the things that the colonists weren't really good at making for themselves, things like glass and paint and lead. And Parliament thought this might go over a little better because it wasn't a direct tax, but no. So if you look at this picture here, this is a tax collector, and a lot of times the colonists took out their anger on the tax collectors. Okay, and what they're doing here is called tarring and feathering. All right, it kind of looks funny, but it was incredibly painful because they would pour like scorching hot tar on him and throw feathers on him, making him kind of look like a bird. But some people almost died from this. So remember, don't tar and feather your buddies because it really hurts. Okay, so one of the problems of having all these British soldiers over here walking around with guns amongst people who really resented having them around and living in their houses, was that something bad was bound to happen. And that was the Boston Massacre in 1770. Now, most kids seem to learn about the Boston Massacre when they are young. This is when British soldiers fired on a, quote, unarmed crowd. This picture here was a famous etching done by Paul Revere. You know Paul Revere. The British are coming. The British are coming. Well, this etching appeared all over the colonies in newspapers, and it was a huge propaganda event. Propaganda is information, sometimes accurate, but usually not. And this really pissed people off. Can I say that? What this didn't really show were the shells and the sticks and the rocks that the people were throwing at the soldiers. I mean, look at these helpless people there. But hey, the British are the bad guys in our story. So yeah, the Boston Massacre was a bad thing, and it really raised tension with the colonists and the British. So once again, the protests worked, and the British repealed the Townshend Act, or maybe they were just feeling bad about that whole massacring thing, but they still wanted to get paid. So in what was a last-ditch attempt, they passed the Tea Act. Now, technically, this wasn't really a tax. It was more of a monopoly, and surprisingly, the cost of tea actually went down, but that's neither here nor there. And you guys know what the outcome is. Maybe you've been to Boston where you can go on one of those old boats and you throw those plastic barrels into Boston Harbor. Yes, the Tea Party. Okay, Samuel Adams and his buddies supposedly dress up as Indians and dump all this British tea into Boston Harbor. Now, this made the British furious. In today's money, it was something like millions of dollars worth of tea. So they were bound to react. And they passed what they called the Coercive Acts. Now, these were a bunch of different acts all kind of rolled into one or passed at the same time. And by calling them the coercive acts, when you coerce someone, you were trying to kind of trick them or force them into doing something. And in their minds, they were trying to coerce us into being good. But we called them the Intolerable Acts. And if something is intolerable, it means you just can't take it anymore. You can't tolerate it. They closed Boston Harbor, they banned town meetings, and we talked in our last video about the importance of town meetings in New England. They started moving trials over to England that should have been taking place here. And, of course, since things were getting pretty out of hand, they sent more troops over here. They also passed a law where they would no longer let elected assemblies meet. Now, assemblies were our own lawmaking bodies, lawmakers who had been voted on by the people. And so from here on out, the colonies were going to be governed by people chosen by the king. So in response, the leading figures decided to get together. And these were mostly the guys who would go on to become what we call our founding fathers. These representatives or delegates is a word you need to know. A delegate is a representative. These delegates met in Philadelphia in what was called the First Continental Congress. And the First Continental Congress sent to the king, King George III, a list of grievances. Okay, they wanted a redress of grievances. And now the word grievance is going to play a big part in our next video on the Declaration of Independence. Grievances are formal complaints. So we were still hoping here in 1774 that the king could make things right, that he could solve our problems. But meanwhile, in Boston, things were taking a turn for the worse. And by the way, Boston or Massachusetts was really where things were the most heated. Okay, this is where the bulk of the British soldiers were located, and the people who were struggling against them, who we refer to as the Patriots. And the Patriots have armed themselves, and in April of 1775, a large force of British soldiers march out of Boston. They're headed towards an armory in Concord, and an armory is where you store your weapons. And what happens is that the Patriots are waiting. Most of you have heard this story. Again, this is when Paul Revere rides. You've got the Minutemen militia, and they are waiting for the British in Lexington. There's a quick battle. The militia retreat, but continue shooting at the Redcoats throughout their march. And the Redcoats pretty much have to run back to Boston, being harassed and shot at and killed by the militia all along their route. Now, what you really need to know about this event is that we have not declared independence yet. Okay, these are really the first shots of the Revolutionary War, but the war hasn't officially started yet. So make sure you remember that when you have to put these events in order. And what's important to keep in mind is that while the colonists were obviously really mad, and so were the British for that matter, the delegates at what was now the Second Continental Congress, and most of the people, were still not thinking that we should become our own country. They still wanted to try to make things work. So when the Second Continental Congress meets a month later, they send a last-ditch petition or a letter to the king known as the Olive Branch Petition as one last attempt to keep the peace. But for many, it was too late. So the delegates, while they're sending out this petition, they're also arming themselves. They're also getting ready for war, okay? And they decide to promote or appoint George Washington as the head of the military. So another thing to keep in mind is that the delegates had not really been appointed to any elected office. Okay, this is like a national government type get-together, but there is no nation yet. Okay, these are still just 13 colonies, but they go ahead and they start preparing for war. This Revolutionary War, and remember, a revolution is when you overthrow the government, which at this point is Parliament and the king. They named George Washington to be the head of the army, but the fighting has already begun. Okay, there's a stalemate reached in Boston. The British are occupying the city, and the Patriots are surrounding it. But we still have yet to declare independence. Okay, now, if there was anyone who still had doubts, remember we talked about this last week, Thomas Paine's Common Sense comes out in January of 1776. There's still some people on the fence, but this really helps push them over. Again, common sense, duh, it's common sense to declare independence, okay? For anyone who still needed convincing, well, this did it. And we finally reached the inevitable. All these events over the past 15 years or so are finally too much to take. It's time for us to go our own ways. The kids are all grown up, and we finally have to declare our independence. And that is where we're going to pick up next time. We are going to look at the document itself, one of the most famous documents in the history of the world. So make sure you subscribe. Again, I hope you learned a little something. Keep up the good work, and you are going to ace that EOC.